Hilchos Kilayim Perek Revi, the laws of forbidden mixtures, chapter 4. Yesterday, we learned that in order to plant two different species next to each other, there's different levels of distance that are required to be made. For example, between two fields of grain, you have to have what's called a base roiva, an area to plant a quarter of a kav. That's 10.2 amot by 10.2 amot. If it's two vegetables, the distance is much smaller, just 6 tfachim, just 6 handbreadths. Today, the Rambam is going to discuss different configurations which will have different applications of these laws of distance. Today, I would say that most of these laws are pretty obsolete because the farming industry is happening on such a large scale that you don't have opportunities to create these small little patches where you have multiple types of species in one little patch. But if you're planting in your own garden and you live in Israel, then these laws could be relevant, in which you would have to know how far to separate between your different types of species of plants or fruits.
There are many now Chabad in Samaria and even in the United States.
That are on smaller scale?
On a very small scale, they're basically a family.
Uh-huh.
They have few this and few that, and they do have 2 shuvot of that and 2 shuvot of that.
Okay, so then I stand corrected. Then for those people, they would have to know these laws, because in Israel, you have to know how far to go. The Rambam starts with the following halacha. Halacha Aleph. Muter lizroya, shtei shurois zu b'tzad zu shel kishuin. You can plant 2 rows, one next to each other, of kishuin. Kishuin is typically translated as zucchini, but yesterday we translated as that special type of melon. It's called a chate melon, or cucumis mello in Latin. You can kind of see it over here. I posted a picture of it yesterday. This is just made with AI. But an actual picture of this kishuin would be right over here. This little melon. It looks like a cucumber. And you can plant 2 rows of those types of things. Ushtei shures bitzidon shel dluin. And right to their side, you can plant 2 rows of squash, the calabash type of squash that they used to have in the olden days. Still have today, but that was the common one. Ushtei shures shel poil hamitzri. And right next to it, 2 rows of Egyptian beans. V'telem bin kol min v'min, with one little furrow, one little row of dirt between each species. That's fine. Why? Because each 2 rows will stand alone as a unique entity. Avol lo yizra shura achas shel kishuin, v'shura achas shel dluin, v'shura achas shel pela mitzri. But do not make just one row after another. One row of the chate melon, one row of the squash, and one row of the Egyptian bean, afal pisha hatelem mavdil ben kol min v'min, even though you have a furrow of dirt or of earth dividing between them, mipnei sheminin elu olin shelahen arukin. Says the Rambam, these 3 species specifically, and the commentaries also on the tractate of Kilayim comment that it's these 3 specific species. They have very long leaves, v'nimshachin u'mistabchin, and the leaves stretch and the leaves mingle. If you're going to plant row next to row, it's all going to get mixed up. And it's going to seem like they were planted complete mixing. But once you have 2 rows, in 2 rows, each 2 rows will stand on their own. It will be clear that there are 3 different species. Halacha beis, hoisa sadehu zrua min mimine yirakos. So I'm going to use a picture here from the Gemara art scroll on the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud of Kilayim, because Kilayim does not have the Bavli. The Babylonian Talmud doesn't have on most of the order of Zerayim, but this is from the Yerushalmi of Kilayim. And it's not a colored picture, but it just brings out the point. You have like this. You have a field that's planted with a specific vegetable. In the Talmud, the example chosen is onions. That's why they write onions here. Okay, so imagine you have an onion field. Ubikesh lizreya besoicha, shurois shel dluin. And you wanted to plant inside it individual rows of squash. Apparently this was customary to plant squash in onion fields. How do you go about planting the squash in a way that doesn't transgress kilayim? So in the Talmud there are 3 opinions. The Rambam rules like the Chachamim, like the sages. Oiker min hayarak, makim shazeireya boy, shura shel dluin. First of all, uproot the area of what would usually be occupied by one row of the gourds, of the squash. So over here you would uproot this area, which is 4 amas, as the Talmud explains. Umavdil beina ubein hayarak betelem. Plus, you have to make a furrow. You see here, there's the furrow. At least in the beginning. It doesn't have to run all the way along the side. At least in the beginning, you have to make some kind of separation in the earth to show that you're making a difference between the onions and the gourds. And this side as well. Between every time the onions and the gourds cross, you have to have a furrow, an empty furrow, at least a little bit going into the row. Then you have to leave 12 amas, 3 rows of the vegetables, in the case of the Talmud of the onions. And then you can make a second row of gourds of the squash, and again making that division of the furrow, and keep on going until the place that you want to stop, making those rows. Which it will turn out between every 2 rows of squash there will be 12 amas. But less than 12 will be forbidden because this squash plant has such large leaves and it could stretch so much into the vegetables between them that if you're going to have less than 12 amas, the whole thing is going to seem like it was planted in a mix. The Talmud calls this a principle of chavush. Chavush is like imprisoned. If you have 2 squash plants on the side and you allow them to grow over the onions, they're going to imprison the onions. They're going to close in on the onions or the vegetables, and you're not going to see the vegetables on their own. It'll seem like they got mixed together. If you leave 12 amas, 12 amas is not going to get closed in, and therefore it's okay. Halacha Gimel, that was introducing squash into onions. Hoisa shura shel glas zrua. If you had 1 row of squash planted, okay, we'll call this on the bottom smaller. We'll call it the smaller row of squash. Afilu glas yichidis. This is how much squash can stretch, even if it's 1 single squash. Okay, not even a row. 1 single squash plant. Ubal izreya b'tzida tevua, and you want to plant next to it a classic field of grain. Marchik beis reiva. You must distance from the squash like you would distance between 2 fields of grain. That huge space of the beis reiva, 10 1/5 amas by 10 1/5 amas. Since the row, or even the single squash, was around from before, it already stretched out, it already made itself comfortable, it's already feeling at home, and its leaves are stretching all over the place, and it occupies a large space, and therefore it requires a bigger distance before you begin the field of grain. As an aside, the Rambam notes, V'chol davar sheyeh b'seich beis reiva, shemarchikin mein shnei aminin. I may have misspoken yesterday when I spoke about this law, and Philip asked me if it has to be totally empty. I said it has to be totally empty. Truth is, the Rambam says, anything which is in this area, which you're using to distance between the 2 species, oila min hamida, can count towards the measurement. You can get an hakever, v'hasela, v'chayetzim, and let's say you have a grave, or a big rock, things like that. Even though it's not totally empty, they still count towards the space. So it's a correction from yesterday. Let's say, unlike in other areas, let's say in the last set of laws, at the end of the Rambam's 6th book, the Rambam said that a field needs to be a certain size to be redeemed by a certain rate. So over there, the Rambam said if you have big ditches or big rocks, they don't count towards the amount of space. Here they do. Because here the point is you're making a distance of space where things aren't planted. So as long as nothing is planted there, even if other things are sitting there, it's okay. Halacha dalet. Hatelem oy amas hamayim sheinamukim tefach. If you have a furrow, or a water channel. So I'm using this picture just to bring out the idea, okay? This is a massive field. You have, let's say, a species, it's just grass, but let's say you have a species of vegetable on this side, another species on this, and then you have a water channel going between them. If, let's say, assuming it's 1 tefach deep. And also the commentators understand that either it's 1 tefach wide or 6 tefachs wide, but at least 1 tefach deep. In this configuration, you'll be able to plant 3 species of plants right next to each other. Echad al svas hatelem mikan, ve'echad mikan, 1 on the edge of the furrow or the water channel on this side, 1 on the other side, ve'echad ba'emtza, and 1 inside that furrow or that water channel. Some plants can grow within water. Yeah, you plant them in the water. Watercress, yeah, exactly. So you'd be able over here, you don't have to have any space because the water channel or the furrow itself is the divider. And therefore, the entities seem separate. Halacha hey, the Rambam goes even further. You can literally plant 2 species within 1 hole in the ground. Even if it's plants that have big leaves, like the chait melon, the squash. Provided that you take care At the first species, you direct its leaves to grow out this way, and the other type to grow out the other way. And they'll seem separate from one another. So too, you plant 4 species into one hole, and you direct the leaves to grow out to each of the 4 directions. It's all allowed. Because the big principle in Kilayim is that they shouldn't look like they're mixed. If you're taking care that they don't look like they're mixed, they're fine. Halacha vav. Haraitza lizreya sadehu meishar mikol min vamin. You have a farmer, he has a little plot in the back of his house. He wants to experiment with a bunch of different plants, and he wants to make, meishar means strips. Okay, so there's 2 pictures here. I'm using one from the Art Scroll Gemara. That's this one here, and then I'm using this one from the Rambam that we use, this English Rambam over here. The point is, the configuration that he wants to make is not squares. It's longer strips. That's how he wants to have. He wants to have a long strip of this, a long strip of that, a long strip of a third type. So here, says the Rambam, Marchik bin kol meishar u'meishar, shtei amos al shtei amos. All you have to do is make sure that at one point along the row, there's a gap of 2 by 2 amas. That's 3 feet. 3 square feet. 3 by 3, so that's 9 square feet. Umeitzar v'hoylech, and then you can taper off and go more diagonal ad shelo yishar beinehen b'soif hameishar ela kolshu, until the point that at the end of the strip, there'll only be a tiny gap between them. Because you've achieved the goal. It looks like it wasn't planted mixed together. See, here's a little bit less clear, but imagine you have the 2 by 2 gap, and then it kind of tapers off at the end. So at the very end, the strip 1 and strip 2, which is 2 different species of plants, are touching each other, but only at an angle. Here maybe you can see it even clearer. You have 1 strip here, 1 strip here. At the very beginning, he makes the full gap of 2 by 2, and then it slowly but surely, until the end, it gets narrower and narrower, and then at the end, it's fine, as long as in the beginning you have that distance. Halacha zayin ratza lasei sadehu karachas mikol min vamin. A person wants to make not long strips, but squares. Karachas means a square patch. Literally, it means a bald spot, but it means a square patch of vegetables. So what's the maximum you can do? Says the Rambam, we use this chart. Lo yasa b'seich kol beis se'ah yasar al teisha karachos. A beis se'ah is an area where you would plant a se'ah of grain. That's 50 amas by 50 amas. Okay? 2,500 square amas. In this area, 50 by 50 amas, you can plant a maximum of 9 patches. Kol karachas mihen beis roiva. Every patch will be about a beis roiva. We'll call it 10 by 10 amas. V'nimtza rachek ben karachas v'karachas karev le'eser amas pachis revia. If each one is 10, let's call it a full beis roiva. Let's call it 10.2. If each square is 10.2 by 10.2, so the space in between will be a little less, or just about 9 3/4. Right? 10 amas minus a quarter. Shekol beis sa'ah chamishim al chamishim, because every beis sa'ah is 50 by 50 amas, and this way you can be sure that you'll have the maximum distance required between any type.
But
if you configure it this way,
if it's in a row, which is very close, and square, which is huge difference by comparison.
Yeah. So it seems like from the Rambam's commentaries that when you make a row is more easily definable from the next row over. As long as you have 2 amas in between, it seems like it's separate. Once you're going to deal with a bunch of different patches, so each patch has to be considered as if it's like a field almost. Same way between 2 fields of grain, you would make a distance of a beis roiva of 10.2 by 10.2. So here also, you have to make, it comes out a little bit less, but the point is a significant amount of distance between each group of vegetables or plants that you plant in this area 50 by 50 amas. What's the difference between a meishar and a karachas in Hebrew? Shahameshar aruch v'hakarachas merubas. Meishar means a long strip, as in this one, long thin strips. Karachas means square, a square patch that you want to plant vegetables. Halacha tes. Mine yerakos. if you have types of vegetables, small garden vegetables, people only plant, to begin with, very little quantity. They don't plant a lot of them. So there's a configuration where you can fit a lot of types of vegetables into one small space. Muter lizreya mehem, afilu chamisha minin, b'seich haruga achas, shehi shisha tfachim al shisha tfachim. In one patch, which is 6 handbreadths by 6 handbreadths, this is tiny, like 2 feet. Okay, 2 square feet, you can fit 5 different species in this little square. How do you fit 5 species in this little square? V'hu sheyizra arba minin ba'arba ruches ha'aruga be'echad ba'emtza. You plant 4 species on the 4 sides, or the 4 corners of the patch, and 1 in the middle. Ve'yarchik bein min v'min k'may tefach u'mechza k'dei shelo yinku zeh mizeh. And you simply make a distance, at least a tefach and a half, between each category, so they don't nurture from each other. As the Rambam himself drew this picture in his commentary to the Mishnah, he says there are 2 options for what this means. This is, we're going to call this 6 tefachim by 6 tefachim. Okay, each square represents 1 square tefach. So the rule is that between 2 types of vegetables, there has to be at least a tefach and a half of space. However, once you include what's called the Rosh Torah we learned about yesterday, at the end of the chapter, I'll just remind you of what it is. It's this. If 2 fields meet at an angle, if a corner reaches a side, or certainly if a corner reaches another corner, then it's totally permitted even if they're right next to each other. So using the Rosh Torah solution, you can do the following. You plant this area, 4 tefachim by 1 tefach is 1 species. The second one goes over here. Notice this little ball over here, these 2 species are touching at Rosh Torah. So that's allowed. Same thing you do over here, third species, and here too you have the Rosh Torah is okay. And then the 4th species, and both of them are touching at Rosh Torah, so it's okay. Then the 5th category of species you make at a diamond, at an angle to each one, where it's meeting the side of each species also at the Rosh Torah configuration. And so you end up having 5 species within 1 6 tefach by 6 tefach square. The other option where you can fill up even more space, if you look at this, is you go 4 corners and then a bigger diamond all across. And again, the diamond is touching the square at each point at Rosh Torah, because the angle of one is touching the side of the other. This one fills up 24 square tefachim. This one actually fills up 27 square tefachim, as you can see at the bottom there. Many other commentaries disagree with the Rambam. They say you cannot use the Rosh Torah solution in these configurations, and they have much more complex ways of introducing 5 species into this space. But according to the Rambam, it's very simple. As he says, arba ba'arba ruches ha'aruga, 4 on the 4 sides and 1 in the middle. Aval yoser al chamisha minin, but more than 5 types. Lo yizra afal pisha marchik b'nein. You cannot plant in this space, even if you make a distance. Lefisha minin harbe ba'aruga kazu harehin kinetuin birabuvia. Too many types in this small little patch. Looks like a mix. No good. Bamedvar Maimonides says the Rambam. When do we say that you can squeeze in 5 types into one little patch? Ba'aruga shehi bechurba ve'ein sham zera chutzala. If it's a lone patch in a destroyed area, in a ruin, there is no other plants outside of it. Aval aruga bein arugais. But if you have a patch amongst other patches, asur lizreya b'chamisha minin, you cannot use these configurations to get 5 plants in. Why? Because if you're going to do it in this patch, that means you want to do it in the next patch over as well. And then you're going to have sides touching at forbidden angles. If you're going to plant on each side of this patch and on all the sides of the neighboring patches, they're all going to seem like they're mixed, and therefore it's forbidden. However, there's a solution. If you're going to direct the leaves to go this way and that way, they're going to go away from each other. Until they seem separate, then it's permitted. You make a furrow between each patch, also permitted. The point is, as long as you do something active to take care of the mixture appearance issue, you're fine. Even if you have this lone patch, you're forbidden to plant anything outside of that patch without making a furrow or without making a little turning of the leaves. Even opposite the corners of the patch where there is no planting. So even in this picture, you have planting on the sides, but in these corners they're empty. So what would be wrong with planting something over here? let's say at the corner relative to this corner. Why? Says the Rambam Gzeira, it's a decree. Shema Yizra Arbas Haminin Ba'arba Zaviyas Aruga. Maybe you're going to use this configuration. You're going to plant the 4 on the corners themselves. The Yizra Minin Achedim Chutzala Keneged Azaviyas. And then you're going to plant other things in the neighboring patches right next to the corners. Then it's all going to seem mixed, and that's a problem. Halacha Yud Beis. Hoysaha Aruga Shisha al Shisha. If you had a square patch of 6 by 6 tfachim, this picture here, the inner square here is 6 by 6 tfachim. And around it was a border. It seems like in those times as well, around these patches they would make this raised border of dirt, sort of as a divider, but also as a walkway for farmers to be able to get through and water the patches properly. So you have this patch, 6 by 6 tfachim, surrounded by this raised walkway, raised border of dirt. At least 1 tefach high, 1 tefach wide. In this configuration, you can squeeze 18 species in this square, if you had to maximize. 3 on each border, as the Rambam shows you. This is a picture that Rambam himself drew. You have 1 species here, a tefach and a half of separation, a second species, tefach and a half of separation, a third species. The 4th species here meets the 3rd at Rosh Tor, so it's okay, meeting at the corners. And you continue going around the circle, tefach and a half of space, species. Tefach and a half space, species. Rosh Tor meeting, and again and again and again, all around, so you get 12 on the side, plus 6 in the middle. This is the Rambam's understanding. 6 in the middle means 6 diamonds in the middle. The yarchik bin kol min v'min tefach u'mechza. And this way, the distance between each one is a tefach and a half, about 3 to 4 inches. So we're talking 6 inches. Yeah, it's very, very small.
So if those diamonds were squares, let's just say you tilted them and made them squares, how much space would you have to leave between
each one? A tefach and a half. So in this configuration,
if you made those all squares, you would, all the white space is empty, right?
The white space is empty, yeah.
So if you tilted all of those diamonds to make them squares.
Yeah, but then the problem would be that you have too little space between these species and the outer squares. The only reason why this is permitted is because these diamonds are meeting the outer squares at Rosh Tor, at an angle. Once you convert them into squares, they're meeting at the sides and they're going to require the full tefach and a half of space distance between them. So you're actually going to lose a lot more space. The commentaries wonder over here why you don't make this configuration. I couldn't put it on the screen, but you can actually fit 9 in the middle. If you make the diamonds smaller, you push them up, right? So the whole point is that they're diamonds. As long as they're diamonds, they're fine. So why not squeeze 3 more in? So you have to know a little math. But if you do the math and you make these types of squares, there's not going to be a full tefach and a half of space between the two. Only in this configuration where the diamonds are elongated do you get, as you can see zoomed up, the full tefach and a half this way, tefach and an 0.8 on a diagonal. Once you're going to raise the diamonds, lower them, make them smaller, you won't have that amount. Even in this configuration, you cannot plant one of these 12 species on the sides, cannot be turnip heads. Because it'll fill up the area and take up too much space, look like it's mixed. Either way, more than 18 species you can't fit into this little square. This is only allowed for types of vegetables. But mine Zrayim, remember this chart here? This is the 5 types of species. You have the grain, legumes, garden seeds. Mine Zrayim is the seeds that you plant in bulk. That's what the Rambam is referring to here. Mine Zrayim cannot be planted in this configuration Kilayim, because they seem like they're mixed together. Aval mine Yirakis, but this category, the seeds planted in small quantities, that's what we're talking about. Since most people only plant from them very little, it's permitted as we explained. Go back to the square. You have a border, the walkway, a tefach high. They did all the planting of all the types as we explained. Now the farmer's walking around, watering his patches. All of a sudden, the raised walkway is no longer raised. Now it's got lower than a tefach. Kosher, shahaya kosher mitchilasei. It's kosher now because it was kosher when it started. As long as when it started it was kosher, it stays kosher. Tesvav, hareitza lemalo is kol ginasei. What if somebody wants an even bigger loophole? He wants to fill up his whole garden with types of little vegetables with no distance between them. Says the Rambam, you got to go like this. Oisa kol hagina, arugais merubais, afilu shisha al shisha. Divide your entire garden into patches of at least 6 by 6 tfachim. V'oisa b'chol aruga chamisha igulin. Forget squares. We're going now circular and oval. Make in every patch 5 circles. Arba ba'arba ruchesel ve'echad ba'emtza. 4 on the 4 edges over here. You see that these are ovals, really. And 1 big circle in the middle. V'zoreya min b'chol igul. Plant a species in every circle. Plus, v'zoreya arba min nimachedim ba'arba ruch karnes aruga. Plant 4 other species over here, in the 4 corners of the patch. So you now have 9. You have 9 species. V'zoreya, nimtzu tisha minin b'chol aruga v'heinirin mudalin zamizah. You now have 9 species in every patch, and they look separate. Ve'einay ma'afsida l'mashe beino igulin bilvat. All you're going to lose is this small space between the circles. Which you leave to allow the circles to appear different from each other and different from the corners. If you needed to maximize every square inch of your garden, you can't lose anything. So the Rambam gives a very interesting solution. You can actually plant this space the perpendicular to the way that the species next to it is growing. Right? Because you ever drive down the highway, you see these trees going this way, right? So if you're going this way, if the circles, plants are going this way, plant the rows in the inside the circles this way. Or if they're going this way, you go perpendicular the other way. So it seems that it's separate. And the Rambam concludes the parak with one final halacha. From all of these things, all these funny cases we spoke about today, it becomes clear to you the moment you've made the proper distance between 2 categories of types, the type of distance that's required, so they shouldn't feed off each other, there's no worry of appearance, as we explained. You did proper distance, you're fine. But if all you've done is assure that they look separate, we don't worry about nursing from each other, as we just explained. So it's a bit of a funny law. Basically, you have to make sure one of 2 things. Either you have the proper distance, or they look separate. If you have proper distance, we don't care if they look together. If they look separate, we don't care if they're nurturing from each other.